I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, if I can remember how to do that. And we'll do this one. So you should be seeing the first page of the packet that we're going to start working on here. And let me get the chat window back up here so I can keep an eye on that too. Okay. So this class is called How to Take Standard Notation, music notation in any key, and convert that to chord melody style dulcimer tab. And the theory is that you can hopefully be able to do that without having a lot of experience in knowing how to read music. You don't really have to read music in order for this technique to work. In fact, if you do read music, you may have to suspend belief a little bit, because we actually, the process we're going to go through here is actually going to be what's called transposing the music from whatever key the original music was written in. The tools that I've given you are going to automatically transpose it to the key of D. So if you read music and you're looking at the original notes and you know that this note is a B flat, and I'm telling you to put that on your melody string at the 3rd fret, and you know that that's not a B flat, the reason that it works is because we are transposing to a brand new key as we're doing this. So the first page over here, the one that says Converting Standard Notation to Tab, this just is the steps that we're going to go through for this process. And the first step is to figure out what key the original music is written in. And the way that you tell that is by looking in the very first measure of the standard notation. There'll be a number of what are called sharp signs, which are these things that look like pound signs or hashtags, I guess we call them today, or flat signs, which kind of look like lowercase b's. And you count up the number of either sharps or flats, and then that'll tell you what key the original music is in. The other way to sort of tell what key the music is in is if the backup chords are in the music. If they above the measures, sometimes they'll tell you like the guitar backup chord. Almost always, 99.9% of the time, the backup chord that's in the very first measure and or the very last measure of the piece will tell you what key it's in. Songs usually start and end using the chord of whatever key they're written in, so that's another clue. Once we know what key, and the way that we can tell then what key it is, once you know how many sharps and flats there are, I've given you 2 sheets. One that says 0 through 6 sharps, and then there's another one that says 0 through 6 flats. And so these are the mapping keys that says, like, for each note, what we'll do is we'll figure out what key is the song is in. Say that we have 3 flats. So we would look through all the measures in this 0 through 6 flats page until we find the measure that has 3 flats, and I see that one is right here, measure 4. And that says that the original music would be in the key of E flat, or it could be its related minor, which is C minor. It doesn't really matter. They both have the same key signature of 3 flats. Then what I do is I just look at the notes that are on the sheet music for the melody line. We're just going to do single note melody line for this step, and say that the note was down here on the bottom space. And I would look underneath there, and there's the number 1 written down here. So that means that I would put that note on my melody string of my DAD fretboard at the 1st fret. I would write a 1 underneath that note, and I would play that note on the 1st fret of the melody string. Remember, we're going to be transposing all these to the key of D. These first 3 notes, where it has a little M in front of it, that indicates the middle string. So if I were in this key of 3 flats and I found a note that was 1 line below the bottom line, like right here, if the note looked like this, underneath here it says M1. That means the middle string at the 1st fret. So I would write a 1 on the middle string for that note when I'm creating my tab. And then we just go through the whole tune note for note and write in the fret numbers. And that's pretty much what we're going to do in part 1 here this morning. When we get to part 2 this afternoon, or I'm sorry, I guess it's the 3rd session today, whatever time zone you're in, Then we'll actually transpose the backup chord names from whatever the original key is to the key of D, and then we'll use that. Let's see, I've got the transposing charts here somewhere. Oh, I put those on the other page here. Let me bring that one up. I've got similar charts. This one over here on the right-hand side of your screen. So this is the chord transposition for the sharp keys, and this is the one for the flat keys over here. And we're going to talk about this in the next session, so I don't want to get into these too much. But between those two sheets, we'll figure out what the new chords are going to be, and then we'll use this last sheet, this is the DAD fretboard map. It tells you at every string, at every fret, what note is there. And then here's a chord speller that tells you for any chord what notes you need to build that chord. So then we'll use this information to figure out how to fill in the rest of the notes on the middle and the bass string. Like I said, that's what part 2 is about. So for part 1 this morning, we're just going to be concerned with filling in just the single note melody. So the example that I'd like to start with is Whispering Hope. So go ahead and pull this one up and get your pencil with an eraser. The most important part of the pencil in this whole process is the eraser. So make sure you've got a good one. So actually the very first step, I guess I'll have to rewrite that and put like a step 0. Before you do anything, just like when you were in grade school, is you need to write your name in the upper right-hand corner where it says Arranged By. Go ahead and write your name on the page there. I'm going to try to do that with my little Etch-a-Sketch thing here. And the reason that it's important to put your name on it is, as we'll see as we go through this, there's always multiple ways to come up with an arrangement for the same tune. We can find the same notes in different places on our fretboard, and so depending on how long your fingers are and how long your string length is, you might find different ways to make the same chord or different places to find the same note to make it more convenient. As we'll see when we go through this, there's always different ways to come up with the same chord and to find the same note. So what you have on your paper will be may well be different from what someone else is going to do for the same arrangement. So okay, once you have your name up there, like we said, the first step is to figure out what key the song is in. So we look at the first measure, and we see that there are 2 flat signs. Let me blow this up a little bit and see if you can see it any better. So I'm talking about these 2 little, what are called flat signs in the first measure. So that's what we're going to use to look up on our fretboard mapping to figure out which measure we're going to use. The other clue is, like I said, the very first chord and the very last chord in the piece. In this case, it's a B flat, so I'm guessing that this means it's in the key of B flat. But let's go over to our fretboard map over here, our mapping sheets over here. And this one is 0 through 6 sharp, so I need the one that says 0 through 6 flats. That's this one. So look at this one. Find the measure on this page that has 2 flats. Okay, the first one, there's 0 flats here, there's 1 flat here. Right here, the second measure, this is the one that has 2 flats. So this is the measure I'm going to be using for this piece, because this piece is in the key of B flat. So let me blow that measure up, because that's the only one we're going to need for this tune. Oh, that's as big as I can make it. So this is the measure we're going to be using. So we're just going to go through now and match up the notes from our standard music over here. We're going to find these notes somewhere in this measure And then whatever number is written down here, if there's no M in front of it, remember the M means middle string. If there's no M, that just means the melody string. So we're just going to go through and find the notes that are in our piece. We're going to find that in this measure and then see what fret number it says to put that on. So the very first note, now that we know that we're in the key of B flat, we're using this measure, the very first note in the piece over the word soft is this note up here on the very top line. So I go to my mapping table here and I look through the scale here, these notes, until I find the note that's on the top line, and that's right here. And then I look at the number underneath there, and that is a 4. So that tells me that this note, when I transpose this to the key of D, I'm going to play that note on the melody string at the 4th fret. Let me get my pen going here. There we go. So I'm going to write a 4 right here on the melody string under that note. Now I'm going to pause here and stop, and does everybody understand how I figured out to put a 4 under this note? If you do not, just unmute yourself and ask your question, and I'll try going through this again. Any questions about that? This is important because everything else that we do in this session is going to be based on understanding how we got here. Any questions at all? Okay, great. So let me get this back down just a little bit so I can see more of the piece.
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Question. So if it has the M in front of it, it's middle string, right?
That's correct.
And if non-melody?
That's correct. Okay, so the next note is actually the same place. It's the same note there. I'm going to blow this back up again so it'll be a little bit easier to see. I'll just have to do a little bit more scrolling. Okay, so this is the same note, so that's also going to be a 4. And the next note is the same. It's also going to be a 4. Okay, I got 3 4s in a row. And sometimes I like to go ahead, if the note is dotted, I usually try to write in the dot down here in the tab, just so that when I start playing it, I'll remember that there's one of those pesky little dots there. Okay, I get to the second measure, and now this note goes to, it's 2 spaces above the top line. So I go back over to my chart here and I look for the note that looks like that. That's 2 spaces above the top line, and that's this note right here. So that is 7. That's what's written under there. So I'm going to go ahead and write a 7 on the melody string under that note. The next note is the one line above the top line. So again, I go back over here, and that's right here. And below that, it says 6.5. So I'm going to write 6.5 on the melody string there. The next note comes down again, and now it's 1 space above the top line. And so here's the note that's 1 space above the top line, and that's at 5. You may start to see a pattern here, and the pattern is for every line in every space, you're just going to add 1 to the dulcimer fret number. So if you can figure out whereabouts the tune starts, if you could figure out maybe even by ear that the tune starts on the 4th fret, then for every line in every space where it goes up and down above that, you would just add 1 or subtract 1. And we'll see where we'll use that later. But so if you realize that, then it gets to be a little bit easier, or maybe a little bit quicker, because you don't have to go back to this chart for every note. Because once you figure out where to start, you can just, this is going down 1 line. From here to here is 1 space. That's going to be 1 fret. From here to here is another space. That's going to be 1 more fret. So that's why this just walks down from 7 to 6.5 and 5. The trick, of course, is you're going to use the 6.5 fret and not the 6th fret normally in the key of D. Okay, the top line is the next note here, and that's the same note that we had in the very first measure. So if I happen to remember that, I wouldn't have to go look it up, but if you don't, just go look it up again, and that's going to be back at that 4th fret. And then the 4th line right here, the next one, so it skips the space and goes down to the 4th line. So I could subtract 1 for this space and then subtract another 1 for this line. If I didn't remember how to do that, I could just go look it up. And right here I see that that is going to be at 2. So I'm going to write a 2 here. That's kind of a 2. I'm still getting used to writing with this sketch pad here. Okay, the next phrase here starts at the very top space. So again, I go over here and I see that the note at the very top space is here. The number underneath there is a 3. So I write a 3, and I put my little dot there, and this note is also the same place. That's also a 3. And this note is also the same note, so that's going to be 3 3s in a row. And then I get to the next measure. This note is 1 space above the top line. Again, I've seen that before, but if I don't happen to remember, I'll just go back over here and look it up again. And that's a 5. And then it comes down to the top line. Again, it's going down 1 fret at a time, 1 note at a time, but if I didn't remember that, I could just look it up again over here, so that becomes a 4. And then it goes to the top space, down 1 more, so I would just subtract 1, but I can just look it up again, and that becomes a 3. I'm having a hard time here. Oh, I ran off the edge of my virtual paper here. Let's try this. And then the last note in this measure is the 4th line, and that's this note right here, and the number below there is a 2. So I go ahead and write it 2 and put my dot on there. So let's pause just for a second. Again, I'm going to ask if there's any questions. Does everybody understand what we're doing here and how we match this up? The key is to make sure that you're looking at the right measure, meaning the one that matches the key signature of the music that you're working on. And this is why you should check your work. Go ahead and get your dulcimer up here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and get my dulcimer up. And we're going to check that, that first line just to see if the melody sounds right. So we have it starting here at the 4th fret. 4, 4, 4, and then 7, 6.5, 5, back down to 4, and then down to 2. And then the next measure goes to 3, 3, 3, 3, 5, 4, 3, 2. Yeah, that sounds right. I think we're on the right track. The reason that you want to check your work like that periodically is because one time I was doing something like this and I got through the entire tune. I'd worked for several hours and I got the whole thing done, and then I went to try to play it and it sounded absolutely horrible. And I couldn't figure out what happened. Eventually I realized that when I was looking, my eye had dropped down, so instead of looking at, you know, the measure that had the 3 flats in it, I had accidentally, my eye had dropped down to the next line, and I was looking at the line that had 5 flats in it instead. And I had done the whole tune using the wrong translation key. And then I had to go back and do the whole thing over. So that's why you want to check every once in a while to make sure that you're on the right track. If it sounds good to your ear, then that's a good clue. Okay, any questions before we just keep going the same thing? Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen again and go back to it. Every time I do this, I lose the chat window, so let me get that back up there. Okay, I can watch the chat now too. Okay, so get my pen back over here. So we left off here. This is at the 2nd fret, and now the next measure, it's tied over and it's the same note. So this is also going to be at that 2nd fret. And I'll put this, sorry about that. I'll put this little mark here so it'll remind me that let me get rid of that if I can. And I'll just move it over. Okay. And now here in measure 9, it starts, actually it's the same note that we just wound up with, so this is also going to be a 2. Again, if I didn't remember, I just go look it up over here, and the note right on that 4th line is a 2. And then these next 2 notes are the same place. They're also going to be 2s. And this next note is the same place. It's got 4 2s in a row here. Okay, now under the 2nd syllable of gentle, it goes up to the top space. And so I go over here, look at the top space. That's a 3, which I could have predicted because it just went up 1 note, 1 line or 1 space. And then the next one is to the top line. That's going up 1 more, so I could have guessed that that's going to be a 4, and that's what the chart tells me. And then here in measure 11, it's back to the space above the top line, which is right here, and that's a 5. And then the next measure, I'm going to 2 spaces above the top line. So here's the top line. Let me blow that up a little bit here. So here's the top line. Here's 1 space above the top line. Here's the next line, and then here's 2 spaces above the top line. So again, I go back over here, and I find that that is this note right here, and that's back to our 7. Oops, I forgot my dot here. I'll write a 7 in here, put a dot, shrink this back down just a little bit. Okay, the next measure goes back to the top line. Top line right here, and that is a 4. And then I've got 3 of those in a row, same note, 4, 4, 4. And now here it goes to the line above the top line, this note right here, which looks like this note right here, 1 line above the top line, and that is going to be at 6.5 again. And then the next note comes down to the space above the top line, down 1, that's going to go to 5. And then the next note goes back to 6.5, that same as the first one in that measure. That's this note right here, 6.5. Oops, sorry. And then the last note in this line, I think that's the last note. Yeah, it goes back up to 2 spaces above the top line. I've seen that before, but if I forgot, I'll just go look it up again, and it's 7. And then I've got that tied over to the first note in the next line, so I can just write that 7 again here. And I'll put my little tie sign there. Okay, measure 17's back up to the top line. That's number 4 right here, so I'm going to write 4. And again, I've got 3 of those in a row. The next measure, I've got, first starts off in that same place, 4. Okay, this next measure, I've got what's called accidentals. Accidentals are where you see like these either sharp signs or flat signs, or in this case it's a natural sign, in the middle of a measure. That indicates that this note is not in the scale of the key that we are playing in. It's called an accidental. When you go to start tabbing out a tune, if you see that the whole tune is filled with accidentals throughout, like every other measure's got another 1 or 2 accidentals, it probably means it's going to be difficult to tab that out for the a diatonically fretted mountain dulcimer tuned DAD. If you only see one or just a couple of these sprinkled every once in a while, you might still want to try it, because maybe you'll have to bend a string in one measure to get that note. But if you see that the piece is filled with these accidentals, you're probably not going to be real successful in being able to translate that piece into a diatonically fretted mountain dulcimer tuned DAD. If you wanted to do a piece like that, you probably would use a different tuning. One of the ones that I use for more chromatic, what are called chromatic pieces like that, is sometimes it's called the 1-3-5 tuning. You tune your instrument to D, F sharp, A. And when you tune your 3-string diatonic dulcimer to D, F sharp, A, you have just about every chromatic note in the 12-note chromatic scale, so you can do a lot of that stuff. Now, these tools that I've handed out today won't help you for that, but there's a whole different set of handouts, a whole different set of tools that you use to use the D, F sharp, A tuning. That's another class. I'll probably do that at some point in the future if you're interested, but for right now, if you want to stick with DAD tuning and you see that the piece has a whole bunch of accidentals, you might want to try a different tune, because it's not going to work real well in DAD tuning. But let's talk about how these accidentals work. And I actually wrote out a separate sheet. I think it was the second one in your packet. Let me go find that one here. It's called Notes on Accidentals. And this tells you how accidentals work. And there are things like sharp signs or flat signs or natural signs that occur in the middle of the tune. This is not the ones that are at the beginning of the measure that tell you what key it's in, but just in the middle of the tune. And like I said, that indicates that note is outside of the scale of the key that it's written in. A sharp sign accidental will always move the note up 1/2 step. So if it normally would be, say, you went through your chart here and you found that the note was going to be at the 3rd fret, a sharp sign is going to move it up 1/2 step, so it's going to be a 3. You'd have to write in a 3.5. You'd have to have a 1/2 step there. And if you don't have a 3.5 fret on your instrument, if you don't have a chromatic instrument, that means that you probably have to bend that string. A flat sign means that you're going to move the note down 1/2 step from where it would. So you'd look at the note where it was without that accidental, say that it was at the top line, and then it had a little flat sign on it. So normally it would be 4, but the flat sign's going to move it down 1/2 step. Halfway between 3 and 4 is 3.5. So again, it would change it to a 3.5 instead of 4. The natural sign behaves differently depending on whether you're working in a sharp key or a flat key. The natural sign essentially just cancels out whatever the normal sharp or flat would be. So if you're working with a flat key, the natural sign cancels out the flat, which means it's going to move it up a half a step. So again, your third fret would move to 3.5. If it's a sharp key and you have a natural sign, it's going to cancel out that sharp, which means it's going to move the note down a half step. And then the other rule about accidentals is once you have an accidental in a measure, all the rest of that same note that appears in that measure is going to automatically have that same accidental applied until you cross the measure boundary. And then the effect of the accidental goes away. So if I had 3 notes in a row that were on the third space and I had a flat sign in front of it, all 3 of those notes would apply that flat even though it only had the flat on the first one, on the first occurrence. And then as soon as you get to the next measure, you just forget all the accidentals that were in the previous measure. So let's go back to our example here because we just encountered a where'd it go? We just encountered a measure that had a natural sign. Okay, so like I said, the natural, let me move this up a little bit here. The natural, now this is a flat key that we're working in, so the natural sign right here is gonna cancel out the effect of that flat. But the first thing that I'm gonna do is figure out where that note would have been. I'm just gonna ignore the natural sign for a second. And I'm gonna go over here and just look up that note, and it's right here, and it tells me that it's at the 3rd fret. So if there were no natural sign, I would just write a 3. The natural sign in a flat key, then we just said in that sheet, is going to move it. It's going to cancel out the flat, which means it's going to move that note up a half a step. So instead of, let me get my pen turned back on here. Instead of 3, which would normally be, I have to move it up a half step, so that's going to be 3.5. And like I said, if I don't happen to have a 3.5 fret, that means that I'm going to have to bend that string. And we'll talk about that. I'll show you that in a second here. Now the last note in this measure, it actually put a flat sign back on it. So remember I said if you once you get to an accidental, it's going to apply to every note to the rest of the measure. But in this case, the composer said, no, I don't want that natural to apply to the next note here. So this is just going to be back to normal. So this flat sign is essentially putting the same key signature flat back on there. So this natural sign canceled out the flat. That's why I had to move it up a half step, or down a half step. Or, I'm sorry, up a half step. And then this flat sign is putting it right back. So now we're back to the natural note in the scale. And so I look at that note, again, it's at the 3rd fret. So it goes from 4 to 3.5 to 3. Okay, I'm going to pause here and ask if there's any questions. Does everybody understand about accidentals? Does anybody need me to go over this again about what you do with accidentals? Okay, great. You must have all had your coffee this morning, if that made sense. Oh, I do have a, somebody just typed in the chat window here. Can't we find the note at the 3.5 fret on the middle string? Yeah, you've kind of stolen the surprise here, but yeah, let's go ahead and talk about that since somebody has already asked. Let's take a look and see what what note is actually are we looking for to play this note. This one that's at 3.5. Let me stop sharing here just for a second, and we'll go back to our instruments. If we were going to play this line, let's start here in the second line. We left off at the first line. Let's start here and do our check just to make sure that it still sounds good. So starting here with the word hope with the gentle, it's down here at the 2nd fret. 2, 2, 2, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then all the way up to 7. And then down to 4, 6.5, 5, 6.5, 7. And now the next line starts on 4, 4, 4, 4. Now we have to bend this third fret. And then the next note goes back to 3. Okay? Now, what note is it that we're trying to play at when we do at 3.5? Well, if we look at, let's go ahead and I'll pull this up. Here's our fretboard map. And this tells us, like I said, for every string, for every fret, what note is there. So at the 4th fret of the melody string, the note is an A. At the 3rd fret of the melody string, the note is G. What note would be halfway between a G and an A? The 3.5 fret, if we had one, would be right here in between the G and the A. Well, that would be a G sharp. Halfway between a G and an A is a G sharp. Is there anywhere else on your fretboard that you can find a G sharp note so that I wouldn't have to bend that? And if you look at the fretboard map here, yeah, right here on the middle string at 6.5, I have a G sharp note. So rather than having to worry about trying to bend that string at the 3rd fret on the melody, I could just change that and write 6.5 on the middle string instead. I will tell you that of all of the accidentals that you find, at least in Western music, popular music, and even old-time traditional music, if you have an accidental, the most common one that shows up is this one that we happen to have on the middle string at 6.5. So the designers of the instrument, when they added that 6.5 fret, they might have had this in mind. Because that's the most common accidental that you're going to find. The second most common accidental happens to be the ones that we find at the 1.5 fret. So those of you that have added a 1.5 fret to your instrument, you're probably going to find a lot of uses for that because of these accidentals. So even in the key of D, you're going to be able to find the note that you need on one of the 3 strings at either the 1.5 fret or the 6.5 fret. Not always. Sometimes you're going to find one at 4.5, or one of the other ones that we don't have. 0.5, halfway between the open string and the 1st fret, is also a fairly common one. But without having to go fully chromatic, you can still find most of those notes just by using the middle string at 6.5 and then the melody string at 1.5. Okay, so let's get back to it here. So this is why you need an eraser, because I've just instead of this 3.5 on the melody string, we just figured out that I can change that. I'm just going to erase that and write 6.5 on the middle string instead. Okay, I'm going to pause here again and make sure everybody understands how we figured out that 3.5 on the middle really is the same note as 6.5, or 3.5 on the melody is the same note as 6.5 on the middle. Any questions about how we got there? How did you figure a 6.5 and know it was a G sharp? Okay. Yeah, let's go back through that again. So I knew that, let me go back to my fretboard map here. I looked at my fretboard map and I saw that at the 3rd fret the note is a G, and at the 4th fret the note is an A. So if I had a 3.5 fret, if I had a fret that would be halfway in between here, that note would be the note that's halfway between a G and an A. If you think in terms of the piano keyboard, you've got white keys and black keys. So the G is a white key, the A is a white key. The 3.5 would be the black key that's in between the G and the A. And that turns out to be a G sharp, or depending on what key you're thinking of, you could think of it as an A flat. G sharp and A flat are the same note. It's exactly the same, just halfway between a G and an A. So if I think of that in terms of a G sharp, then I just look on my fretboard map here, and I'm just looking all over the fretboard to see is there any place on the fretboard where I find a G sharp. And lo and behold, right here on the middle string at 6.5, I have a G sharp. So the note that would have been here between the G and the A on the melody string is actually right here on the middle string at G sharp. Let's see, I got another. Whoops. Let me pop out my chat window here. Do we have a fretboard map page? I don't see it. Oh, you know what? That's in the Part 2 class. I think that was in the Part 2 handouts. I'm sorry. This sheet right here that I'm referring to over here is in the packet for Part 2. Because we'll be using that mostly this afternoon, but I forgot that we'd need it to talk about these accidentals. Yep, sorry about that. So if you look in the packet that that we printed out, for right now, just look on the screen, but you have it in the sheets that you'll have for the Part 2 class if you don't have that handy right now. Yep, sorry for that confusion. Okay, so is that clear now?
Right.
Am I not screen sharing? Oh,
Do you have that up on the screen right now?
I'm sorry. I did that whole thing and hadn't there. This is the one I'm talking about. Let's do that again. So here is the 3rd fret, which is the G. Here is the 4th fret, which is the A. And so halfway in between here, if I had a 3.5 fret, the note would be the ones that are halfway between, that is halfway between a G and an A, which would be a G sharp. And so now I look on the fretboard here, and I'm looking up and down to see where can I find a G sharp, and lo and behold, right here on the middle string at 6.5 is where I have that G sharp. Here's the 6.5, so that's telling me that note that's at 6.5 is G sharp. I guess it's a lot better if I actually remember to share the screen when I'm when I'm circling all this stuff. Turns out that we have another G sharp way up here at 13.5. That's an octave higher though. So if I were playing this tune an octave higher, I could find the G sharp up here, but I don't want to jump an octave there, so I can just use the one here. Yes, thank you for letting me know that I was not sharing my screen. This is going to make a lot more sense now, I hope. So again, we found that the note at the 3rd fret was going to be a G. The note at the 4th fret was going to be an A, and I'm looking for the note that's halfway in between. The 3.5 would be a G sharp. And then right here on the middle string at 6.5 is where I found that G sharp. Okay. Now, does that make more sense now that you could actually see it? Okay, good. So let's go ahead and go on here. The next measure is the back to just the 4th line, and I go over here, and I find that note on the 4th line is a 2. So I'll just write a 2 here. And then we go back up to the 2 spaces above. That's this last note here. That's a 7. And then it comes down to the line above the top line. That's 6.5. Those are all the same note, and here's the same note again, another 6.5, and it goes back up to this space up 2 spaces above, and that's back up to 7, and then 1 space above, that's right here, that's back down to 5, and then the top line, that's back down to 4. And then down to the next line here, that's tied over, so that's going to be another 4. And then this is back up to 7. This note right here is 7. And then it's got 3 7s in a row. Make that 4 7s in a row. Then it comes down to the this note, which is 6.5. And then to a 5. And then the top line, which is right here, which is 4. Whoops. And then it goes all the way back up to this note right here, which is back up to 7. You can kind of see that, you know, you keep seeing the same notes over and over, so you start to remember, oh yeah, this top line is a 4, and this one up here is a 7, so you don't have to, you can kind of start doing shortcuts after a little bit. But if you don't recognize that, don't worry about it, just do each note one at a time. The next one here is the 4th line, which is right here. That's a 2. And then we got 3 of those in a row. And then the next measure is the top line, so that goes back up to 4. And then it comes down right here to 3. And then it comes, here's one I haven't seen before. It's the 3rd space. Let's see, 3rd space right here. That's a 1. So I'm going to write a 1 right there. And then the last measure, don't think I've seen this one before. That's this 3rd line. 1, 2, 3. That's 0. That's the open melody string. And then that's getting tied over here, so I write another 0 here. Ah! Sorry about that. Oops, sounds like the ice cream truck. That's actually my 10-minute warning, so we have 10 minutes to finish this out. I think we'll be fine. Okay, then it goes back up here to the top line, and top line is 4. And that gets tied over to another 4. And then this is 5. That's this note right here, which is 5. And then it goes the next one up here. That's this note right here. That's 6.5. And then it goes back up to that 7 again. And that gets tied over. And then it comes down here to 6.5. And then it goes back up to 7. Uh-oh. What are we going to do with this one? This note right here, which is 2 lines above the top line. And my mapping sheet only goes up to the space, 2 spaces above the top line. Well, remember we said that every time, for every line and for every space, you just keep adding 1. So this is going to be 1 more above my scale. I went off the scale here. I went off the dial. So the next note, if this is 7, I'm just going to add 1 to that. So this has to be 8. So I'm just going to write an 8 here. And then that gets tied over to the same note. It's going to be another 8. I'll pause here briefly. Does everybody understand how I figured out that this was 8? Because I start here at 7 and then I just add 1 for each line and for each space above it. So this is one more line above the top thing here, so that's going to be, that's why this is an 8. Okay, then this comes back down to human hearing range to 7. When you get up this high, you don't have to worry about it so much, because even if you don't get the right frets, only dogs can hear that high anyway, so you don't need to worry about it. Just kidding. Okay, then this is another 8. And now here, it goes up another step. So this is going to be 3 spaces above the top line. Oh, somebody said, what do you do when the notes run below the scale, below where we have the middle string? Oh, then the next one lower than the middle string open is the bass string at 3. So it goes from the middle string. It would go from the middle string at 0, then the next one lower below that would be the bass string at 3, and then it would go 3, 2, 1, 0, and you can't play any note lower than the 4 notes below the middle string, basically. Okay, this next note here is 3 spaces above the top line. So we've got 1 space. This is going to be, so the next line here would be 8. And the next space above here, I'm going to add 1 more to that. So that's going to be all the way up at 9. So like if this note right here is 7, the next line is 8, the next space is 9. So I'm going to write a 9 right here. And then I get back to the last line. Starts up at 9. And then this comes back
I
down.
don't think it goes to 9.
I'm sorry, you're right. I misread that. That should be a 7. Thank you. Yeah, because this note is this note right here, which is 7. Then it comes back down to the top, the space above the top line, which is a 5. And that gets tied over to 5. And then the next note here is 6.5. Goes back up to 7. Then it comes back down to the top line, which is right here, which is 4. And that gets tied over to another 4. And then it comes down one more step, or one more line, the 4th line right here, which is 2. And then it skips a space and comes down to the 3rd line, which is right here, which is open. And then it goes back up to the top line, which is 4. Then the top space, which is 3. And then the 3rd space, which is right here, that's 1. And then the 3rd line again, which is open. And then that's tied over to the last note. Okay, let's try playing through that whole thing, if I can get the whole thing on the page so I can see it. So I'll stop my share here. We'll go back to your instrument. Are you guys seeing the chat window? when I go back to the, I guess you're not. I'm going to move it out of the way here for me. Okay, so let's play through the whole thing. Just the melody string again is all we have so far. So it starts up here at 4, and then 7, 6.5, 5, 4, and then down to 2, and then back to 3, 5, 4, 3, 2, and that gets tied over to the next line, stays on 2, walks up 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to 7, and then down to 4, 6.5, 5, 6.5, 7, and that gets tied over the third line. Then the next measure starts at 4. Now 4, 6.5 on the middle, and then back to the melody of 3, then down to 2, and then 7, and now it's 6.5, 6.5, 7, 5, 4. Tied over to the next line, and then the next measure starts up at 7, 7, 6.5, 5, 4, then back up to 7, all the way down to 2, 4, 3, 1, open, and that's tied over. And now the next phrase starts at the 4th fret, and then it's tied to 4, 5, 6.5, 7, and then it's tied again, 6.5, 7, 8, 2, 3, tied to 8, 7, 8, all the way up to 9, and now the last line back down to 7. And now the next measure, 5, and then it's tied over, and then goes 6.5, 7, 4, and that's tied, and then down to 2, 0, 4, and then down to 3, 1, open. Yeah, that sounds like the tune to me. If you're familiar with the tune Whispering Hope, I think we have the melody line. So come back at session 3 and bring this sheet back, because we're going to start here where we left off, and then make sure you have the other packet, because now the next phase is going to be figuring out what we're going to be putting on the middle and the bass string to fill out the chords that we need for the rest of the chord melody arrangement. And like I said, to do that, we'll be looking at this sheet primarily. We also need to, the next step is going to be to transpose those chord names. Right now the chord names are in the key of B flat, and we need to find out what the chords are going to be in the key of D, so we're going to use this chord transposition sheet to do that, and we're going to talk about that in session 3. And then once we know what the chords are, then we'll use the chord speller down here to figure out what notes we need for that chord, and then we'll look at the fretboard map to find out where we can find those notes. So that's in session 3, so come back for part 2.